Anarchism, like any ideology, has its different sects. I'm going to focus on mainly left-leaning anarchism, as it is more poorly understood. Two are Anarcho-Primitivism and Anarcho-communism, the former being no representative government in a most basic human and natural form, and the latter arguing that people are naturally equal without a state that would treat each other as such, with common ownership of various things. This most basic form is both primitive and also natural. It comes with the understanding that a state results in both development through an economy, as well as oppression of other groups through a brutal police force, or sheer numbers or influence of a very significant minority. Most people that I've talked to understand the definition from Merriam-Webster being 1b, a state of lawlessness or political disorder due to the absence of governmental authority. While it also can be said in 1a, in simple absence of government, that it does not have this negative connotation necessarily. That's anarchy. Well, anarchism is different. In tribalism, there is no need for advanced hierarchy or government, as there is simply the individual and small groups owning their own tools and thereby their labor, rather than a government or corporation evaluating and deeming how much this is worth through various forms of influence, such as subsidies, political donations, market manipulations, and buying out smaller businesses, which is how large corporations are still part of the state. Before I go any further, there are a ton of different types of anarchy, which is why this short video only really covers two. Anarcho-communism is meant to have equality through absence of a dictating state, with people living in smaller communities. The state does not decide how equal you can be. There is direct democracy. The people themselves become society and the government. In small groups, they are less likely to oppress one another because they are right next to them. It is hard for lethal and foreign apathy and sociopathy to develop, which has enabled horrific events in history. Because if you're able to demean someone as a lesser human, it is so much easier to purge, erase, discriminate, and or eliminate them, such as the Germans in German Southwest Africa. Not to forget that colonialism initiated out of a sense of superiority to begin with. Great economies come from great oppression by a state, which is why anarcho-communists want to abolish it, but not replace it with an authoritarian regime like the communists understood through Yugoslavia and the USSR, which said they were communist entities. Anarcho-communism and workers controlling their own labor occurred to a great extent in Spain and Aragon and Catalonia as a strong counter-movement against fascism around the 1930s. Equality is achieved by these small communities directly controlling their labor. Anarchy can be so much more than simply a state of disorder, but also a system of government through the lack of a state, caring much more about the individual, because the people know those around them. It can also be a state of disorder, though, if not intentional nor willed by the people. Anarcho-communism is not a centralized planned project, but rather people will live in a small and natural community, have much better control on what happens for better or for worse, rather than an aggressive state deciding everything. Economically, it's almost guaranteed to be slower, despite mutualism being reverse capitalism, and believing that voluntarily firms competing over workers would effectively drive the economy instead, with people voluntarily working for these firms, and the firms being composed of people who decide to do so. Greater the lack of government involvement in the economy is an indirect form of oppression by the state, because these same corporations decide what goes on, and they use the countless people to fund the projects and wealth of the few. And this leads to great economic growth overall. Very few actually truly prosper. And that's part one. I'm going to make another part about Anarcho-syndicalism and Anarcho-egoism and focus a bit more on mutualism. But that's going to be in like 4 weeks.